He also, in the next painting in that series, a painting called Destruction of Empire, he tried his hand at one of those great vortexes of light and shade and energized atmosphere that Turner made his own signature style in early works such as the Hannibal that you've already seen. When Cole was back in this country painting The Course of Empire, many of his earlier patrons were concerned that he was going to forget what he had earlier done so well, American scenery. Indeed, he did not, but Turner's lessons of how to portray nature grandly and with such energized excitement can be seen in other great works right here in the Metropolitan, hanging not in the American galleries, which are closed, as you know, but now in the Lehman wing, Cole's great Oxbow of the Connecticut River of 1836, where again the notion of the clearing of a storm or the passage of a great atmospheric drama brings to what is otherwise a pure landscape an element of history, or at least some overlay of the historical drama. But Cole was shocked when he saw Turner himself. There are wonderful cartoons of Turner that began to appear in the 1820s and certainly proliferate in the 1830s and 40s. He's often shown at work, the implication being that he's at the Royal Academy on what was called varnishing days, when the artists were allowed to, quote, touch up their pictures. Here you see a caricature of him with a mop and a bucket of yellow paint, apparently getting ready to go at one of his canvases. One writer said of Turner that he was like a chef who was obsessed with using seasoning, and that he used too much yellow, too much whatever it was that would season a painting and make it unpalatable. It's interesting when one begins to read criticism of Turner during his time, which was often not just savage, but was often extremely funny, how often certain kinds of anecdotes or allusions are made that suggest criticism that would be applied from then on to painters that we've come to think of, or artists that we've come to think of, again, essentially modernists. One, or more than one critic compared Turner, as I've said, to a chef who'd gone wild with his ingredients. Others said that his works looked like they had been done by a child, or that someone had simply thrown the painting at the canvas, the paint at the canvas. And they were talking about works, such as the later works, not the Hannibal here, but such as some of the ones that Professor Shama showed us. In fact, the most probably harmful to Turner himself criticism that was leveled at him was that he must be insane, because his own mother had indeed gone insane. But the image of Turner the man was very hard for people who saw him or met him to reconcile with Turner the artist. And when Cole saw Turner at his gallery, he said, "I had expected to see an older-looking man with a countenance pale with thought, but I was entirely mistaken. There is nothing in his appearance or conversation indicative of genius. He looks like a seafaring man, a mate of a coasting vessel, and his manners were in accordance with his appearance, and can scarcely reconcile my mind to the idea that he painted those grand pictures." So by the time that Cole is digesting Turner's work at first hand, Americans are beginning to hear about this strangeness of character, and they are also beginning to hear that his works are very odd-looking. Most Americans, through the first 4 decades of the 19th century, who knew anything about Turner would never have seen an original Turner oil or watercolor. They knew simply prints that Turner had authorized in most cases to be done after his works. And in the medium of print, particularly prints in black and white that had not been hand-colored, Turner came across as a rather subdued-looking artist. Linearity seemed to be the style, classicism that looked like 17th century works by Claude Lorrain or other great masters of landscape seemed to be the ruling mood. And it was hard to understand who this other person that they read about, that they heard about was, who the painter of a painting like this version of the burning of the Houses of Parliament, where those strange things do happen, where light seems to dissolve form, and where paint on the surface of the canvas seems to take on a life of its own. It doesn't conform to actual structures or actual forms that are legible. It becomes a thing unto itself. Cole noticed this as well and said of Turner, "His present pictures are the strangest things imaginable. They are splendid combinations of color when it is considered separately from the subject, but they are destitute of all appearance of solidity. Every object appears transparent or soft. They look as though they were made of confectionary's sugar candy jelly." And Cole was not alone in this. And so the question becomes, if Americans who were looking to painters like Cole and the other artists who were beginning to create the Hudson River School, Asher B. Duran, the young Frederick Church, and others, if they were looking to them to establish an important national school of art, and if Turner was being held up as an example, how did they reconcile these different aspects of who this man was, and more importantly, what his art seemed to be about, what they knew it to be about from the prints, what they heard it to be about from accounts, and what they saw ridiculed in critical writing and popular caricatures. Well, along came the young John Ruskin. This is not the young John Ruskin, this is John Ruskin later in life. But John Ruskin, as a young man, was incensed at criticism that was leveled at Turner, particularly at a painting called Juliet and Her Nurse, where Turner had taken the, among other liberties, of setting the scene in Venice rather than Verona. When we heard earlier that he didn't care about such details as location or historical sequence of events, that is absolutely true. But Ruskin took it upon himself to become Turner's champion. He wrote to defend Turner. He wrote a letter to a magazine, which he sent actually to Turner to review, or Ruskin's father did, and Turner advised not to respond to such critical attacks because they weren't worthy. Ruskin didn't publish the letter, but he did go on to write what would become the multi-volume series of books called Modern Painters, which began with its first volume appearing in 1843. It appeared in sequence over the next several years and became one of the most widely read books in the history of 19th century art, and especially widely read in America. Indeed, Ruskin himself said that he found a better appreciation and a better understanding of what I am and what I mean than I ever met in England, in America. So what was Ruskin's scheme to defend Turner? Well, if any of you have ever read Modern Painters, and as a diligent graduate student I did, you will know that it is a book fittingly, according its principal goal to defend Turner, that is itself full of contradictions, absurdities, plain things that are completely impossible to understand, but through it run two major themes. One, that Turner was worthy of consideration with the great tradition of landscape painting that had seen heroes such as Claude Lorrain and Nicolas Poussin and others, that he belonged in that sequence, that he was a part of history. And secondly, that in spite of what people might say about the appearance of Turner's actual work, that he was fundamentally truthful to the observation of the natural world and to the depiction of its forms and its effects on canvas or on paper or on in prints. American patrons, critics, collectors leapt to this defense. They read about these things. They didn't see the works themselves because there was a corresponding interest in American poetry, American writing about nature, and American painting of seeing itself as part of a grand tradition that was now taking root in the New World, but had essentially foundations in the Old World, but also had something new and vital to do, and that was essentially establish a style that was factual, that was truthful, that depicted the American world, the American scenery, whether it's the wilds or the Catskills or the White Mountains, or later the Western plains or the chasm of the Colorado or wherever, that it didn't need to exaggerate because America had, as one of its intrinsic sort of prides of ownership, an extraordinary landscape.